"Do not sign that," Grace said, and the sentence crossed Min-jae's dining room so cleanly that 12 executives stopped moving before anyone remembered she was supposed to be serving coffee. Min-jae's pen remained above the signature line as he looked from the acquisition agreement to the woman beside the silver service, whose job had begun only 11 days earlier. Grace knew he disliked interruption, distrusted improvisation, which meant being wrong could cost her the first stable job she had found while pregnant. Her health insurance had become active 6 days earlier. Still, one paragraph on the open contract had turned her stomach colder than fear, because the Korean text beside the English version did not merely translate the same promise differently. It changed who could control a critical part of Min-jae's company after the acquisition, and someone at that table was about to let him sign it. Daniel Cho, Min-jae's attorney, recovered first and told her the transaction was private, keeping his voice courteous enough to make the rebuke unmistakable. Grace set down the coffee pot, then answered that private transactions became expensive when the controlling language contradicted the version everyone thought they had reviewed. Min-jae did not raise his voice, which unsettled her more than anger would have, because he had not decided whether she was reckless or useful. When he asked what she had seen, she pointed to Section 14 and explained that the English version preserved termination rights after a majority ownership change, while the Korean version required a transfer of distribution authority before any challenge could begin. Daniel insisted the wording came from outside counsel, but Grace told him the real question was which language controlled if the versions conflicted. The answer sat 3 pages later, and Daniel's face changed when he found it. The Korean version governed without exception. Min-jae lowered the pen and asked how Grace had read enough from across the table to catch something his legal team had missed. She could have offered a harmless explanation, but harmless explanations had become another form of hiding. "I read Korean," she said, and when Daniel pressed her on how well, she admitted she had spent years reviewing cross-border commercial documents, where one altered verb could move millions of dollars. Min-jae's eyes sharpened, because he recognized professional precision when he heard it. Grace rested one hand beneath her stomach as the baby shifted and wished intelligence did not always seem to arrive with a bill attached. Daniel reread the provision and finally admitted the discrepancy could shift West Coast distribution rights before Min-jae's company had a realistic path to terminate. Min-jae ended the meeting, ordered both language versions preserved, and told Daniel to pull the revision history before anyone contacted the seller. After the executives left, Grace remained beside the sideboard wondering whether protecting his company had cost her own job. Min-jae asked where she had learned to analyze contracts, and Grace reminded him that he had hired her to run a household, not supply a biography. He answered that interrupting a 9-figure acquisition made her background relevant, but she told him relevance did not equal ownership. Something almost like amusement crossed his face, then disappeared when Daniel's first message arrived, showing the Korean draft had been altered 6 hours after the English version was finalized. The edit had been made with credentials belonging to Kang Hyun-woo, Min-jae's younger brother, who ran the Busan operation and had opposed the acquisition for months. Suspicion settled into Min-jae's face so quickly that Grace felt herself standing in another office, watching another powerful man decide a name beside a document was the same thing as proof. She told him the system showed whose credentials were used, not whose hands were on the keyboard, and when he asked why she cared about that distinction, her answer came sharper than intended. Because people ruin lives when they decide what evidence means before they finish finding out what it is, she said, then wished she could pull the sentence back. Min-jae understood that the warning had not come from theory, yet instead of confronting his brother, he ordered access logs, badge records, device history, and outside counsel files preserved, with no accusations until the facts were complete. Only after ending the call did he look at Grace and ask the question she had spent 4 years avoiding. "Who taught you to think like that?" Grace met his eyes, knowing the dangerous clause was no longer the only secret in the room. Grace did not answer immediately, because the truth rearranged how people looked at her, and she had spent years building a life where nobody expected expertise. Min-jae noticed the resistance and, instead of pushing harder, asked whether whatever happened in her previous career could create risk for his household or company. That distinction loosened something defensive, so she told him no, then admitted she had once worked in federal compliance on Korean commercial matters. When he asked whether she had been an attorney, she said yes, though her Illinois license was now inactive by choice. Min-jae looked toward the contract and asked why a former federal attorney was managing dinner schedules and household staff. Grace gave him the only answer that felt honest, without exposing the whole wound. Because silver does not ask you to defend your judgment when powerful people want a different answer. Before he could ask more, Daniel returned with an access report that complicated everything. Hyun-woo's badge had entered the Busan office 18 minutes before the Korean document was edited, and the change came from a secure workstation assigned to his division, making accidental misuse less likely. Min-jae's patience thinned, but Grace reminded him that stronger evidence was not complete evidence, even as her own mind leaned toward a familiar conclusion. Daniel knew the bilingual process and seemed less surprised by the mismatch than Grace thought an innocent lawyer should be. Min-jae asked who had authority to reconcile the final language versions before signing, and Daniel hesitated just long enough for Grace to notice. "There was supposed to be a bilingual reconciliation review this morning," he said, "but the seller moved the signing window forward, and I allowed the packet to circulate before that review was completed." That fact changed Hyun-woo's action from inexplicable sabotage into something more complicated. Daniel explained that earlier drafts had contained the disputed transfer provision in both languages, but it had been removed from English during negotiations after Hyun-woo argued it created too much operational risk. Hyun-woo later restored the provision only in the Korean working draft, believing the mandatory reconciliation step would force the discrepancy back onto Min-jae's desk before anyone could sign. Grace asked whether Daniel had known about the restoration, and his pause answered before his words did. He admitted Hyun-woo had warned him, but said he expected the reconciliation review to catch the change until the seller demanded an accelerated signing. "Then you knew the versions were not clean when you put that contract in front of him," Grace said, hearing accusation enter her voice. Daniel did not defend himself, which made Grace more certain for several seconds and then, unexpectedly, less certain. He said Hyun-woo had been trying for weeks to slow the acquisition because customer concentration reports from the Busan target did not make sense, and he had asked for 48 more hours to trace related companies. Daniel believed the concern might be real, but he also believed altering the Korean draft was unacceptable, so he planned to force both brothers into the same room after reconciliation flagged it. The accelerated deadline broke that plan, and Daniel made the worst decision available. He let signing proceed, assuming Min-jae would review the changes. Min-jae's anger rose, but Grace heard something in the explanation that reminded her how easily a bad process could make imperfect people look like conspirators. She asked for the customer reports before anyone discussed motives again. The documents showed 3 large customers listed as unrelated entities, each representing less than 12% of annual revenue, yet Korean registration details suggested their ownership might overlap. Grace traced the names across translated records, while Min-jae called Hyun-woo, and when the video connected, his younger brother looked exhausted rather than defiant. Hyun-woo admitted changing the Korean draft, and said he had expected reconciliation to stop signing, never imagining Daniel would circulate the packet early. Min-jae demanded to know why he had not raised the concern directly, and Hyun-woo answered that he had, 3 times, only to be told the seller had been vetted and the board was tired of his caution. Grace watched Min-jae react, as if the sentence had struck somewhere private, then noticed Daniel's eyes drop toward the table. For the first time, she understood that the contract discrepancy was not the central problem at all. The real question was why a careful executive had decided a procedural trap felt safer than being heard by his own brother. Hyun-woo shared the ownership records, and within minutes, Grace found the first concrete reason his concern had survived 3 dismissals. One company appeared under an English trading name, while another used its Korean branch designation, making them look unrelated, although both pointed to the same parent group. Daniel confirmed the translation issue could explain part of the concentration gap, but Grace kept tracing addresses, officers, and renewal dates until a 3rd customer folded into the same structure. Counted together, nearly 40% of revenue depended on one corporate family rather than several independent customers. Min-jae asked whether the seller had concealed that deliberately, and Grace told him the records supported a serious disclosure problem but did not yet prove intent. "You always leave 1 inch between what you know and what you think," he said, and she answered that the inch was where innocent people sometimes survived. The sentence should have reminded her to apply the same discipline to Daniel, yet Grace pressed him harder than the evidence justified, asking why he had let the signing packet reach Min-jae after learning the Korean version was compromised. Daniel admitted his decision had been indefensible, then produced time-stamped messages showing he had asked the seller to postpone signing and been told the transaction could collapse unless Min-jae executed that afternoon. Grace felt embarrassed because she had mistaken his evasiveness for hidden loyalty, rather than the shame of a lawyer who knew he had made a bad call. "I thought you were protecting someone," she finally said. "I was protecting my own judgment," Daniel replied, "which may have been worse." Grace nodded and forced herself to admit she had assumed too much, while Min-jae watched as if the correction mattered more than being right. Outside records arrived before midnight and confirmed 37.6% of reported revenue flowed through companies controlled by the same parent group. Hyun-woo wanted to take the findings directly to the board, while Daniel recommended independent verification before anyone accused the seller of misrepresentation. Min-jae agreed until a message arrived saying the seller's chairman would walk unless the acquisition resumed by noon the following day. The old reflex returned quickly. Min-jae began talking about months of work, board expectations, and the danger of letting an unproven concern destroy a major deal. Hyun-woo went silent on the screen, and Grace recognized practiced surrender rather than agreement. When Min-jae suggested signing with stronger warranties and investigating afterward, she asked whether he understood he was recreating the condition that had driven his brother to manipulate the process. His face hardened, and he told her she was a temporary consultant, not a member of his board. The words landed where he did not intend them to, because Grace had heard a polished version 4 years earlier from a supervisor who preferred hierarchy to inconvenient evidence. She closed the folder and told Min-jae that he was right about her title, then added that the analysis would remain true even if she left the room. He understood immediately, but Grace refused to rescue him with an easy apology. Hyun-woo finally said the seller's deadline did not change the ownership records, and Daniel added that stronger warranties could reduce financial exposure without restoring credibility to the disclosures. Min-jae stared at the screen, then asked Hyun-woo to present the full analysis at the morning board meeting while outside counsel completed verification overnight. The choice did not erase the insult, but it forced him to behave differently before Grace forgave him. After the call, Min-jae asked why his mistake had affected her so sharply, and Grace finally explained what she had refused to tell him before. 4 years earlier, her federal unit had investigated a contractor suspected of routing restricted technology through third-party distributors, and Grace found overlapping officers, fragmented payments, and addresses suggesting the intermediaries were not independent. Her supervisor considered the evidence circumstantial and politically inconvenient, while Grace became so convinced that resistance meant corruption that she stopped listening to anyone who questioned her methods. She was right about the hidden network, but wrong about what being right entitled her to become, and by the time another team validated part of her analysis, she had resigned under the weight of isolation and an internal complaint about her judgment. Resting one hand against the life moving inside her, Grace said quietly, "I am not going back to being that person just because I found another room where the evidence matters." By 9 the next morning, independent counsel had confirmed the overlap, and Hyun-woo stood before Min-jae's board with 30 pages of records reduced to one uncomfortable number. 37.6% of the target company's revenue depended on businesses controlled by the same parent group, despite repeated disclosures placing concentration below 12%. Victor Hale, a director who supported the acquisition, argued the discrepancy could be priced into the deal and that abandoning months of work would be emotional. Hyun-woo answered without defensiveness, explaining that the problem was not only concentration risk, but the seller's decision to present related entities as separate customers across translated filings. When Victor raised the unauthorized contract edit, Hyun-woo did not excuse himself or hide behind urgency. He admitted he had restored the clause to force a reconciliation review, acknowledged that the method was wrong, and asked the board to evaluate his misconduct separately from the evidence he had uncovered. For half a second, Grace saw Min-jae prepare to answer on his brother's behalf, then stop himself before the old instinct became action. Hyun-woo continued alone, explaining that his mistake created risk because he had assumed process would compensate for a relationship where he no longer trusted himself to be heard. Victor looked toward Min-jae and asked whether he intended to tolerate that kind of insubordination inside a family-run company. Min-jae's first answer came colder than Grace expected. He said trust did not erase accountability, and Hyun-woo would face an internal review for changing the draft without authorization. Then he added that discipline could wait until the board had decided whether it cared more about a bad method or a material fact. The distinction denied everyone the easy option of turning one brother into a villain and the other into a victim. Grace watched Hyun-woo absorb the answer without gratitude, which made the moment feel more honest. Elaine Mercer, another director, then turned toward Grace and asked why Min-jae's butler was sitting in an acquisition meeting. The question carried no insult, only a demand for legitimacy, yet Grace still braced for humiliation. Min-jae did not rescue her. He simply waited, giving her the space to define herself rather than borrowing his authority. Grace explained that she had been retained separately as a temporary bilingual compliance consultant, while Daniel remained counsel, and her role was limited to identifying inconsistencies for review. When Elaine asked about qualifications, Grace stated them plainly: former federal compliance attorney, Korean proficiency, cross-border commercial experience. Victor called the arrangement convenient, and Grace replied that unexpected competence was not convenient evidence. Elaine gave a small nod, then returned to the records instead of Grace's employment history, which was exactly what Grace had wanted. The vote to suspend the acquisition passed 7-2, but the victory carried immediate costs. The seller threatened to terminate negotiations. Outside advisors warned that months of fees could be lost, and Victor requested an emergency finance committee session to consider whether stronger warranties could save the transaction. Nobody applauded, and Min-jae did not pretend the decision made him heroic. After the meeting, Hyun-woo asked why he had finally been allowed to answer for himself, and Min-jae admitted he had confused leadership with being the strongest voice in every difficult room. Hyun-woo did not forgive him on the spot. He only said that being heard once would not repair 15 years of being treated as cautious rather than capable. Min-jae accepted the criticism without defense, but Grace noticed the effort it cost him. That afternoon, while reviewing translated customer files in the library, Grace felt a tightening low across her abdomen that forced her to stop speaking mid-sentence. Min-jae noticed immediately and asked what she needed rather than telling her what to do, which irritated her less than the fact that the pain frightened her. She called her obstetrician, was advised to hydrate, rest, and monitor the contractions, and learned there was no emergency unless they became regular or stronger. The reassurance did not erase the harder realization that she had begun working the same punishing hours that once hollowed out her old life. Min-jae offered to delay the review, and Grace almost refused simply to prove she remained useful, then recognized the old pattern before it could make the decision for her. "I am taking 48 hours off," she said, closing the file. "Not because I am fragile, but because I am done confusing endurance with worth." Grace stayed home the next morning, and Min-jae quickly discovered how much he had begun using her clarity as a substitute for his own. By noon, Victor circulated a memorandum arguing that the acquisition should be revived at a lower price with stronger indemnity protections, while Daniel confirmed the seller had offered revised disclosures and financial concessions substantial enough to make the deal attractive again. On paper, the risk had become cheaper, which made the decision more dangerous because walking away could now look like pride rather than discipline. Min-jae sat at the finance committee table with Hyun-woo across from him and listened while Victor argued that the company had found the weakness, priced it correctly, and improved its downside protection. A week earlier, Min-jae might have approved the deal simply to prove suspicion did not rule him. Instead, he asked what happened if the concentrated customer group declined to renew after closing, and the answer erased much of the comfort from the revised price. Revenue could fall by nearly a third in year 2, with restructuring required before replacement contracts stabilized operations. Victor called that manageable, but Hyun-woo remained silent until Min-jae finally asked what he was withholding. His brother hesitated, then said the discount bothered him less than the fact that the seller had corrected a material disclosure only after being caught. Victor replied that they were buying assets, not character, and Hyun-woo answered that character affected asset value whenever trust determined whether the next disclosure could be believed. Daniel added that stronger warranties reduced financial exposure, but could not eliminate execution risk or the possibility of additional reporting problems. Min-jae looked at the revised projections and understood there would be no document capable of making the choice morally effortless. Grace had forced him to see evidence. But she had also warned him not to turn her judgment into his courage. He voted to terminate negotiations, explaining that the seller's credibility problem now belonged inside the commercial analysis rather than outside it. The final vote was 5-4, and Victor warned that Min-jae would have to defend the lost fees and abandon growth plan to investors. Min-jae accepted that burden without blaming Hyun-woo, Daniel, or the seller's deadline, because responsibility was the part of authority he had distributed least visibly. That evening, he kept his dinner with Hyun-woo at a quiet Korean restaurant downtown, with no lawyers, spreadsheets, or conference table between them. His brother said Min-jae should have listened earlier, and Min-jae answered yes without qualification. Hyun-woo seemed almost irritated by the lack of resistance, then said changing the contract had been wrong even if the concern behind it was right. Min-jae agreed, then apologized for creating a culture between them where certainty received respect and concern received impatience. Hyun-woo did not offer instant forgiveness, but he admitted that forcing the reconciliation process had been easier than risking another dismissal to his face. "You made it easier to manipulate procedure than to trust conversation," Min-jae said, and his brother answered that both of them would have to live with that truth. They agreed Hyun-woo would remain in charge of Busan operations, but lose unilateral document edit privileges until the internal review ended, preserving accountability without erasing the evidence he found. Before they left, Hyun-woo asked whether Min-jae trusted Grace because she had been right. Min-jae thought about the question and said no, because the more important thing was that she had been willing to admit when she herself was wrong. 2 days later, Grace returned to the estate to hand her consulting files back to Daniel, moving more slowly but feeling steadier than she had when she left. Min-jae told her the acquisition was dead, then explained the revised offer, the finance vote, and the conditions placed on Hyun-woo without once asking whether she approved. Grace listened, asked several questions, and finally said the decision sounded like his rather than hers. That distinction seemed to relieve him more than praise would have. She then told him she was ending the consulting arrangement permanently because the pregnancy had exposed something she could no longer ignore. Hiding from judgment had become as unhealthy as being consumed by it. "I do not know whether I want law again," she said, "but I know I do not want fear choosing for me." Min-jae nodded without offering money, a title, or a solution, and Grace realized his restraint was the first thing he had given her that did not create another obligation. Grace remained on household duty for 3 more weeks, but the work changed after she stopped treating it as a hiding place and began treating it as a job chosen for one season of her life. Min-jae stopped asking about her plans after maternity leave, understanding that curiosity could become pressure when it came from someone with more money and authority. Daniel's internal review concluded that Hyun-woo had violated document control policy, but had not intended the altered draft to reach signature without bilingual reconciliation. The company responded by requiring independent bilingual sign-off on every controlling cross-border agreement and creating a formal escalation channel for unresolved risk concerns. Victor remained on the board, still disagreed with Min-jae often, and was not transformed into a villain simply because he had wanted the acquisition to survive. Grace liked that, because maturity was easier to believe when disagreement survived the ending. The baby arrived several weeks later, healthy, loud, and entirely unimpressed by Grace's attempts to organize life around a schedule. During the first month at home, Grace discovered that exhaustion felt different when it came from caring for someone she loved rather than proving she deserved a place in a room. Motherhood did not answer the professional question she had postponed, and for once, she resisted forcing certainty before it was ready. Daniel sent a note asking whether she would consider occasional document review work after leave, with no expectation that she return fully to legal practice, and she surprised herself by accepting one small assignment. The work frightened her because competence reopened the possibility of wanting something she had trained herself not to miss. When another attorney challenged one of her conclusions, Grace changed it without hearing betrayal in the disagreement, and that quiet correction meant more to her than being right. 3 months later, she filed to reactivate her license and opened a small cross-border compliance practice that allowed her to choose clients and protect boundaries she once treated as weakness. Daniel referred the first 2 matters, neither connected to Min-jae, which mattered because Grace wanted the next chapter to belong to her before anyone powerful could claim credit for it. Min-jae did not offer to invest, did not send clients without permission, and did not suggest that working for his company would be easier. When he eventually asked whether her firm would bid on a future bilingual review project, he sent the same formal request he would have sent any outside consultant. Grace laughed when she saw it, then submitted a rate high enough to remind him that respect could also arrive as an invoice. His procurement team negotiated her down by 6%, which she considered evidence that the relationship had finally become normal. Hyun-woo remained in Busan and later took over the company's acquisition risk committee, where his job was to make sure unfinished concerns reached the people responsible for deciding. He and Min-jae still argued, sometimes loudly, yet the arguments changed after both men stopped treating disagreement as a referendum on loyalty. Min-jae learned to ask what evidence would change his mind before asking who had challenged him, while Hyun-woo learned that being ignored once did not justify manipulating a process the next time. Neither brother became easy, and Grace would have distrusted an ending that changed them overnight. What changed was smaller and more durable. They became responsible for the effect their habits had on everyone around them. On the first anniversary of the abandoned acquisition, Grace returned to the estate carrying her daughter against one shoulder and a signed consulting agreement in her bag. The dining room looked almost exactly as it had the morning she interrupted 12 executives, except the contract waiting at Min-jae's place had already passed 2 independent bilingual reviews. Min-jae asked whether she had checked Section 14, and Grace told him she had checked every section because paranoia was still not the same thing as diligence. He smiled, then asked whether she ever regretted speaking up that first day. Grace looked at her daughter, at the table where silence had once seemed safer than being seen, and thought about how easily people confuse strength with certainty, loyalty with obedience, and endurance with worth. "No," she said, "but I am grateful I finally learned that having a voice does not mean I have to use it alone." Min-jae nodded, and for the first time nobody at that table needed Grace to save them from a decision they had refused to examine themselves.